I come from a long line of hippopotami. Hello, my name is Will, and this is Exploding Helicopter, the podcast that's always on the search for Britain's next top model. Today, Roger Moore is best known and loved for his decade-long turn as Britain's most oversexed super spy. As James Bond, he would routinely foil fantastical espionage plots armed with little more than a cocked eyebrow and a well-timed double entendre. But what's all but being forgotten, assuming anyone even knew in the first place, is that before Sir Rog was issued with his license to kill, he got to give his 007 persona a dry run in a movie that's fallen between the cinema seats of film history. So, on this show, we're reviewing Crossplot. To help me review the film, I'm joined by a man who doesn't mind his Latin plurals getting wet. It's Kirkham of the Movie a Days, Richard Kirkham. Welcome back to the show.
Thanks, Will. Glad to be here. And if I get some wet double entendres, I'll let you know.
Well, I'm glad to have you back for this one because, like me, you're a massive James Bond fan. And after I discovered this film, I was keen to discuss it on the pod with a fellow 007 fan because it seemed so interesting given where Moore's career went in the years after this film. Because this film definitely seems to tread over some of the same ground, and certainly sort of Moore's caricature of his performance is kind of similar. And we were chatting just before we started. This is a film that, I had never heard of until someone brought it to my attention last year that it had an exploding helicopter in, and I think you were in the same boat to myself.
Yeah, I had never heard of it whatsoever. It was his. I don't think it was his debut film. I think there were a couple of things that he was in before. I don't know if they made it to theaters or if they were TV movies, but this was supposed to be a theatrical release, and you could certainly see the seeds of his version of James Bond in this particular film, because he plays it with the same kind of insouciant, casual, devil-may-care attitude that he gives to 007 in the following 10 years.
Now, obviously, as a James Bond fan, you'll have seen all of Moore's 007 outings. But before we talk about Crossplot, I wanted to ask you, what you made of Moore's sort of non-Bond movie career, because Crossplot came out at a time where Roger Moore had just finished making The Saint, which had run for about 7 years on TV. And this was kind of his attempt to move full time into movies, as you mentioned. Like before, The Saint had really sort of taken off. He'd been around, making in the studio systems and made a few films. But here he was trying to sort of launch himself as a leading man. And obviously, the Bond films, completely changed his profile. Really elevated him into a star. And I just wondered, what you made of Moore's sort of non-Bond outings.
Well, I think for the most part, he was cast as a kind of romantic leading man, not necessarily the tough guy, although he often was playing a supposed tough guy. There are a couple of films, Shout at the Devil and Escape from Athenia, where he's supposed to have some allusions to being a little bit more authoritative. But for the most part, he was kind of the romantic lead with a little bit of action man kind of thrown in on occasion. Between Live and Let Die and The Man with the Golden Gun, he made a film called Gold, which was directed by Peter Hunt, who had directed a previous Bond film, On Her Majesty's Secret Service. And I think that he ended up working with Hunt 2 or 3 more times. And they definitely had the 007 style going, even though it wasn't really an action heavy picture, it was perfectly fine. It was entertaining, and for its time, I think it worked reasonably well. Some of the other films that he made over Escape from Athenia was like a World War II picture, and I'm trying to remember. I think Telly Savalas is in that movie also.
It's got an incredible cast. There's like Sonny Bono is in it, David Niven. I think even like Elliot Gould is in it, Stephanie Powers. I mean, it's was it? Yes, somebody, or is it Claudia Cardinale? I mean, it's a bonkers cast, a fairly bonkers movie as well, but enjoyable in a sort of daft action adventure type way.
Yes, exactly. And I can't remember all of the films that I saw. Because frankly, I saw some of them when they came out and have them, that was 1979, let's say, for The Wild Geese. And I don't remember it at all.
Well, I think it's time we got stuck into Crossplot. So let's see if Trailer Man can tell us a little about the film's star.
Meet Roger Moore. Honest, good-humored, clean living.
Oh, what do you think about English weather, Miss Cougar?
It always seems to be raining, Mr. Penn.
A young man who minds his own business. How could such a pleasant, easygoing chap get involved in a cross plot?
Here, catch.
The poor fellow means well, but everywhere he goes, utter chaos.
You can undermine a fair-sized country with a couple of well-placed brides.
The plotters. The cross-plotters. Saintly Roger Moore. Treacherous Martha Hyre.
Fire.
Calm down, will you?
Friendly Alexis Canner. Shy, retiring Claudie Lange. Hungry for love. And fried chicken.
I had better have a good night's sleep.
Can I help?
Now, what could she possibly do for you that I couldn't do better?
He's a real go-getter. Morning, noon, and night.
So much fuss over nothing.
Crossplot came out in 1969. The story centers on Gary Fenn, a top advertising executive whose racy playboy lifestyle is rudely interrupted when he is unwittingly caught up in an international conspiracy. Unbeknownst to him, the sexy star of his new ad campaign has overheard the details of an assassination plot and is now being pursued by dangerous killers. As Fenn and his female companion navigate a series of perilous situations, they uncover a conspiracy involving a shadowy organization that is plotting to bomb off a visiting African head of state. In the classic traditions of these films, the duo must work together to thwart the plot and stay alive. Alongside Roger Moore, the cast includes Martha Hyre, Dudley Sutton, Alexis Canner, and 007 alumni Bernard Lee. The film was directed by Alvin Rakoff, who had a very long and prolific career in film, TV, and theatre. Interestingly, he had his own connections to the Bond films, as Rakoff is the man who gave Sean Connery his first leading role in a film. There are also more Bond connections here, as one of the writers on the film, Lee Vance, was married to Eunice Gayson, aka Sylvia Trench from Doctor No and from Russia with Love. And it's also worth noting that Moore wasn't just the star of the film. He was also one of the producers, although he's not credited as such. This film was made by a production company he'd set up with one of the figures behind the Saint TV series that he'd been working on. When it was released, Crossplot was not terribly well reviewed, and that seems reflected in the opinions of the public today, as the film has a user rating of 5.4 on IMDb, although strangely it seems much better thought of by users of Letterboxd, who give it a rating of 3.2 out of 5. So with all of that out of the way, Richard, what did you make of Crossplot?
Crossplot is one of those films that comes from that era that is perfectly serviceable for an afternoon's entertainment, but not one of those things that is ever going to be on somebody's must-see list. It's from the very beginning, there were some improbabilities that were just hard to overcome. The villains immediately kill their first victim on a bridge. I know there's a name for that bridge that's right there by Parliament crossing the Thames. I don't know what the name is. It is essentially empty. Now, I know it's supposed to be 6 o'clock in the morning, but there is no one there. And two cars managed to pin down two people on the bridge long enough for one of them to run away, one of them to withdraw from them, and then get tossed off the bridge. And there's not a soul in sight in London. That just told me right away, okay, this is just one of those films. We're gonna live with the improbabilities and hope for the best. And it's full of 1960s references, the kind of the psychedelic era that's going on there. The clothing imitates that. There's an anti-war movement that is led by by a bunch of people that Brad Pitt would call damn hippies. And, they become kind of tangential to the plot. There's a connection there to what's going on. The plot doesn't make much sense when we discover it.
Really
By the way,
doesn't.
we don't discover it until an hour into what's going on, and it's not that interesting. And I don't know why they needed this complicated plot to kill this guy that they're after. Lee Harvey Oswald could take care of it with a gun from the top of a building. Why they have to manufacture this event to be a television production is beyond me. But the part where Roger Moore shows up into the movie, it's like the seedling of the James Bond that he's going to be. We first encounter him. He's in a romantic clutch, and he gets interrupted by a beeper reminding him that he has to be someplace. So he has to leave the woman that he is engaged in a sexual escapade with and run out the door dressing himself. And I'm going, I've seen this scene 3 or 4 times in the following 10 years. I think it's the first scene in Live and Let Die. It's the first scene in his last Bond film also. So, that seems a little bit repetitive. I enjoyed the touch where he's driving by the milk truck and he just reaches over and picks up a bottle of milk, and then he's not stealing it. He does toss the driver some money as he does that, but that seemed like a very Bond kind of thing from the Roger Moore era. Some smart ass, clever little humor bit to kind of set the mood for what's going on. And then he has to beat his boss into the office, racing the elevator, and then crawl over a window washer's platform to be able to get into his locked office, so it appears that he's been there the whole time. None of that has anything to do with the plot. It's all just humorous setup of the character. So I appreciate the character from the very beginning. But that's about as far as I can go in saying something positive about the film, because the rest of the film is just not very good. It wanders around and introduces us to characters that don't seem important, and then later on turn out to be important, and then we meet a character who's important, and then he's just off the screen. It's like, okay, why is this happening? And the answer is because it's just really a way to kill some time. It's not really about anything. It's not something that you're supposed to be paying much attention to.
Yeah, I think I'm in a very similar boat to yourself. I mean, I think there's a lot you can say that is negative about this film. It's very cheap looking. The plot doesn't bear any kind of scrutiny. It really doesn't. It's a very slight film. It's very silly, but I still found it very watchable. Now, maybe I'm bringing some of my own sort of prejudices as a James Bond fan and as somebody who enjoys Roger Moore's performances. I watched a bit of The Saint, seen a bit of The Persuaders. He often plays a similar sort of character in those television series as he does in the films. It's a pretty thin film, but I found it kind of watchable, kind of enjoyable as a bit of a Roger Moore curio and a kind of like mid-afternoon time killer. It's a perfectly watchable film. I certainly wouldn't be recommending this film to anybody who isn't a Bond fan or who doesn't have an interest in Roger Moore. I think we're the sort of perfect audience for this film.
Yeah, I think so too. It was one of those films that it's like a lot of those films that if you came across them and you had time to spend with them, you'd enjoy watching it while you're watching it, but you wouldn't recommend it to anybody. And it's not like you went there to see that particular movie. It's just one of those things that kind of came up and you said, well, that's kind of intriguing. Let me check that out. It's kind of nostalgic for me because I lived through that era and I remember a lot of those kinds of films. There was a movie out about the same time that starred Oliver Reed and I think it was Michael Crawford, called The Jokers. And it's about a couple of guys who decide to steal the crown jewels as a practical joke. And it's set in that same time period. It's full of the same kinds of psychedelic references. It doesn't make much sense, but while you're watching it, it's fine.
Yeah, I mean, I think that this film also, sadly, I think it suffers when, in comparison to the other types of films which it's clearly influenced by, or the kind of similar, or the kind of films that you'd also slot into the same sort of genre as Crossplot. So So it's very much in that sort of north by northwest vein of
They
of
wish.
they certainly do wish. And I think that's the trouble with Crossplot, is that yes, this is a film very much of that sort of north by northwest ilk. It's for it's things like charade or arabesque, those same similar sorts of thrillers that were around at the same time, but it doesn't have the same level of star power. It doesn't have the same glamorous locations, and it doesn't have the big set pieces sort of every 20 minutes to pique your interest if it has been starting to slump a little. And the limitations of this film, I think it's a bit unfortunate. Yeah, I fear it suffers when you start inevitably comparing it to other films that are of the same style and type.
That's definitely true. And when you see Bernard Lee show up, and at the beginning he's almost like a clone of the character that he plays in the Bond films. He disappears from the film for a period of time and then shows up again. I think, are they trying to suggest that there's something here this is a takeoff on the Bond films? That M is part of a plot to create fascism around the world? I don't know.
I suspect even the writer of the film doesn't know the answer to that question. And yeah, I mean, I think there are some other issues. Putting aside the financial constraints, I do think there are some other issues that this film really struggles with. I think the villains in this film are pretty weak, as we've mentioned. Bernard Lee turns out to be the big bad behind it all, but he's only in the film for sort of 2 seconds right at the beginning, and then he turns up at the end, and it's not a reveal, it's not a surprise. It's just frankly confusing for the audience, because as I think you were mentioning earlier, it's kind of like, what exactly are they trying to do here? I mean, their plot sort of essentially it's to destabilize the UK, but to what end is not entirely clear, and it's not really entirely clear how this assassination is really going to lead to any great. I mean, it'd certainly be a media sensation, but it's hard to imagine that this is going to have any sort of ripples further than that. And I think the details of the plot, we're so far into the film before we really get any meat put on those bones, and it does hurts the film a bit. And even with the limited constraints they're working with, some of those things could have been worked a bit better, I feel.
Oh, definitely. It's just one of those. There are missed opportunities, but the opportunities are missed deliberately. They are looking to create a film that is all style instead of something that is really a thriller. And so they get some of the stylish stuff, but they leave out anything that would be compelling.
Well, let's talk a little bit about the style. And I've mentioned that this is a very cheap movie, and I think that is most apparent in the incredible amount of back projection that is in this movie. Now,
There is a lot.
I'd like to think that I've watched a lot of films from across a lot of decades, and yep, in older films you're going to see back projection, very common tool for using. But I don't know what you felt, Richard. I felt even for the standards of the day, it's a lot of back projection. I mean, did they get out of the studio at all?
Well, there are some chase scenes in the cars that you just ask yourself, could they not put a camera on the hood and shoot backwards? It makes no sense, because they would have the car chase going on, and we'd have great scenes where you could see the cars doing things on the roads. And then they would do the back projection, and you'd go, well, that looks crappy. Why did you do it that way?
Yeah, and it's also a bit of a shame, because there are a few moments where they clearly are out on the streets, and there's a good sequence where Roger he's just saved Claudia Lang on the rooftop, and he's chasing after Dudley Sutton, who's running off, and there's there's a bit of a foot chase scene, and then this mystery car comes into shot, and you think they're about to take out Roger Moore, but actually they're there to bump off Dudley Sutton, and that was actually a really nicely staged sequence. And if we could have had a bit more of this, it really would have elevated, I think, the film, even taking into account the issues we were saying with the villains and with some of the confusion in the story.
Yeah, and like we said before, there are characters here that could have been intriguing. It seemed like there was some suggestion that Martha Heyer's character was at one point interested in what's his name, Gary Finn,
Yeah.
and was going to be a line of pursuit, a way to get information or to stuff his connection to the plot, but nothing happens there. It's all just talk.
Yeah. Let's talk a little bit about Roger Moore here. And as I was mentioning at the top of the show, he'd come out of The Saint, which had been a very successful television series, and we're still a few years away from Live and Let Die here. And obviously, once he gets into the James Bond films, it was kind of his job to be embroiled in international intrigue. And obviously here he's an amateur unexpectedly thrust into that arena. Yeah, how do you think Roger Moore acquitted himself here? I mean, we've touched upon it already, but yeah, how did you find his performance and the
Well,
persona he was adopting here?
I did think that he did a nice job chasing that guy across the buildings and down into the underground and out onto the street. I'm not exactly sure that I would say he was well, he certainly isn't a trained martial artist. He's not taking guys out with a mere karate chop to the back of the neck instantly. He was okay. He throws an okay punch. There are a couple that didn't look all that okay. They looked a little lame, but of course in the movies they hit, and so that part was fine. I guess the idea that he is a womanizer and has had to escape from jealous husbands or to beat the clock on his boss on a regular basis gives some explanation as to why he's light on his feet and capable of doing some of these sorts of silly bits of business. And he was fine. Again, that I'm going to use that phrase frequently in the show, aren't I? He was fine because I didn't hate the movie. I'm not enamored of it, and I liked him, and I kind of liked what he was doing. Like I said, I think he gets better at doing it in the Bond films, and it fits better with the way they wrote the Bond films and the production values that they added to it. So it makes a little bit more sense.
Yeah, I mean, I would say Roger Moore, I think, is probably by far and away the best thing in this movie. I think he'd established a kind of character and persona in the Saint series, and this is a continuation of it here. It's somebody who is a bit of a ladies' man. He's a playboy. There's little bit less of an explanation, as you were outlining, as to how or why he can sort of handle himself with the rough stuff. But, we can overlook that for a film like this. But, this sort of character that he's playing in this film where he's somebody who can he's clearly portrayed as somebody who sort of skates through life, relying on his charm, relying on his wits, to get himself out of the trouble that he finds himself in. And he's got that sort of suave knowingness down to an absolute T. And I certainly not making a case for Roger Moore being a great actor. And certainly if you read anything Roger Moore's own interviews, he certainly makes no great claims about his acting ability. But having said all of that, there is still a skill to being this lightweight, I think. And I wish I could think of a slightly better way of phrasing it. But in a piece of fluff like this, I mean, you wouldn't and couldn't put Lee Marvin in this film and it work. You can put Roger Moore in it and it works. And that's down to what the attributes and skill of Roger Moore.
Absolutely. He has a light romantic persona that comes across pretty well. When he's called upon to be the tough guy, that's when it's a bit of a stretch, but he does it occasionally. But the idea that he is really a ladies' man and kind of observing everything that's going on and bemused by what's happening and participant, as a very reluctant participant in all those things, I think that comes across pretty well. So he was well cast for that kind of character here.
Yeah. Now, this film takes place in London in the late 60s, and it takes place against the backdrop of what you would call like swinging London. And those scenes were a reminder to me that I don't think anything has aged as badly as the portrayal of 60s youth culture. What I want to ask you, Richard, is why is it always so bad?
Well, because it's easy to think that what we're looking at are the clothes and the music and the way people were protesting, that's really what defined the era. It was a colorful period of time, and it was outlandish. I mean, one of the things that's true is that the time period deserves to be mocked a little bit. It was full of pretentious, world-changing ideas, that people were going to use transcendental meditation to create world peace. And if we listened to the right music and played,
Like the right drugs.
took the right drugs and had the sitar playing in the background, that's what was going on.
Okay, we're going to take a quick break, and when we come back, we're going to be looking at the exploding helicopter action.
Robin Hood and Little John, Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid, Bonnie and Clyde. And now, meet the most lovable bad guys in the business, Ulysses and Charlie, the street people. Roger Moore and Stacy Keach are Ulysses and Charlie. They're the perfect team.
You want to bet I can get to you before you can get to the gun?
One is polished,
First we ask questions, then we drown him.
polite,
Bring him up.
and persuasive.
Who hired you to hit Continental?
I didn't hit Continental.
Drown him.
The other is cool, capable, and crazy.
Hold on, baby. Daddy's gonna take you on a cosmic ride.
One has a way with words.
You are the true genius of the world.
Who's going to argue with you?
The other has a way with wheels. They both have a way with women.
Feel like doing some work?
Why not? Hi. Would you like something else over here?
I certainly would.
When they get together, everything starts coming apart.
I'm interested, but I've got to test drive it first. Oh, I better test the brakes.
From the hills of Sicily to the streets of San Francisco, they're turning things upside down
Being crazy?
and inside out.
It's not bad, but I really don't like the color.
They get into some tight spots. They have some close shaves and a few bad scrapes. But they always come through with flying colors. And they never lose their sense of humor.
The fat one is Max Murder, and his main interests are loan sharking, extortion, and an occasional murder.
Well, everybody's got to have a hobby.
Roger Moore and Stacy Keach are Ulysses and Charlie,
No, don't you.
the most lovable bad guys in the business. Street people.
We're back, and now we're looking at the exploding helicopter action. This occurs midway through the film. The villains have tracked our heroes down to a country house where some vital exposition is taking place. They escape in a classic sports car and quickly find themselves pursued by a trigger-happy gunman on board a Aerospatiale Llama helicopter. Our heroes take evasive action by heading into a wood, but find themselves under fire again when the gunman is lowered down into the trees on a hoist. Fenn and Marla head off in the car again, chased by the helicopter, with the gunman still dangling under it. Fortunately, the hapless goons don't notice some upcoming power lines, and when the hoist comes into contact with the cables, a surge of electricity causes the helicopter to explode. Richard, what did you make of the exploding helicopter action?
Somebody was trying to come up with an action scene and didn't know what the hell to do with it. You dangle somebody from a hoist on a helicopter, they're going to spin like crazy, and shooting a machine gun in a 360-degree angle is not going to get you the people that you want. But that's not what happens in the movie. It's like he's just it's like they've turned him into Superman, flying with a machine gun, chasing people through the woods. How he manages to avoid hitting the tops of the trees, I don't know. But when they run into the power lines and we get the exploding helicopter, I was flabbergasted. I'm sorry. I know that you've seen hundreds of exploding helicopters in movies, and I have seen many, many as well. I'm not sure I've seen one as cheaply and poorly done as this. This looked like it was an outtake from a Godzilla film from the 1960s that was not good enough to be released into the world. It was not good.
I suspect that this is where a large chunk of the budget went on hiring the helicopter for this scene and staging this, because I think there is actually, the bones of a pretty good action sequence here. They're driving across this field in this vintage car, the helicopters swirling around them, and the gunman's on board, and some of the photography there is actually
Yeah,
pretty
it's
good.
North by Northwest kind of stuff that's going on there.
Yeah.
Okay, I can see this. Here's Bond out escaping from Spectre as he's being chased in from Russia with Love. Only instead of hiding under a rock, they're hiding in the trees. That part's fine.
But the dangling, I do agree with you. The dangling from the helicopter is completely ridiculous, and I would love to know. He doesn't spin round, but you can see the poor guy on the end of that rope is very close to sort of starting to spin round at various points, and I'd love to know how much they had to photograph. How much of it was actually usable. I think they probably had tens of thousands of feet of footage they had to dispense with, because they're like, oh, he's spinning round on that rope again. This looks terrible. So they managed to cobble together enough seconds of footage of where he's doesn't look completely flummoxed by being on the end of this rope to put together this scene. But I mean, I think it may well come down to my experience of seeing quite so many exploding helicopters, Richard. I actually didn't think that this exploding helicopter, I didn't think it was too bad. I hate, this is a warning probably as much as anything else. I've seen a lot worse. I mean, we do get, in order to kind of shoot the collision with the power lines, it switches to what are clearly models of the power line and of the helicopter. It's very clearly models there. But for the standards of the day, it's pretty well done, although I make no great claims for the special effects in this particular sequence. But you have seen something here, Richard, though, that has, as a connoisseur of exploding helicopters, has kind of died out in films where helicopters explode, because sort of in this period there was a bit of a, it was a fairly standard way for a helicopter to be dispatched, was for it to be seen fly into some power lines. In fact, the very first film ever to feature an exploding helicopter, which was 1955's Breaking the Circle, that collides with some power lines. And yeah, it was a fairly sort of common method of destruction. But I'm struggling to think of many films in the last 30 years where a helicopter has exploded after flying into some power lines. So I don't know whether that is.
Did we get a helicopter exploding flying into a windmill in one of the Mission Impossible movies?
It doesn't explode; it crashes.
Oh, okay.
So I don't include that, but if you set up a rival site, you can make the case for including it. Yeah, exactly. There you go. But as a method of destruction, it's kind of it's somewhat sort of died out. Although you'd probably, having watched this film, you'd probably say, and with good reason, on the evidence available here.
Well, I think the thing that emphasizes how, I don't want to say amateurish, but how awkward the exploding helicopter looks is the insert of another back screen shot of Moore and the female co-star riding in the car, looking over their shoulders at it. And the texture of the film stock is so different. The lighting is so different. It just feels like somebody has edited this together the best they can, and they shouldn't have. They should have just left them out of it entirely. And I think it draws attention to the fact that you're not really seeing something that's happening.
Yeah, it's no classic of the exploding helicopter genre, but it livens up, I feel, even with the limitations, it livens up this film, and I was happy to see it included here. And the first for Roger Moore of several films he would feature in with an exploding helicopter. Probably his crowning glory, as I'm sure you'll know and agree, Richard, The Spy Who Loved Me, Roger Moore's finest exploding helicopter moment.
I think we have multiple there, yes.
We certainly do. Certainly do. Okay, I think that just about wraps things up for this show. Richard, thanks for joining me once again. Before you head off, is there anything you want to plug?
I would just like to remind people that the Large Association of Movie Blogs has a podcast that comes out on a weekly basis, and we have both a video channel on YouTube, and it's available on all the podcasts. So make sure that you check in for the Lambcast on a weekly basis.
As always, don't forget to check out the Exploding Helicopter website for more reviews and information about films where helicopters explode. If you can spread the word about what we're doing somehow, some way, I'd be very grateful. If you want to follow us on social media, we're on Blue Sky, Instagram, Facebook, and Letterboxd. We'll be back soon, but until then, what should people do, Richard?
Keep watching the skies for those exploding helicopters.
This podcast is a proud member of the Lamb Podcasting Network. Find the network at largeassmovieblogs.com.
Did you really come to give me a job?
No, I came to take a mud bath. I come from a long line of hippopotamuses.
Hippopotami. Latin plural.
Yes, well, my suit, English singular, is ruined.